I should begin with addressing the question of why there's a question mark here. You know, why Black Lives Matter, question mark. And when I thought about this talk, I thought, well, I could come in and say Black Lives Matter in the way that everybody else does, but really, let's make it challenging. Some people, of course, when you say Black Lives Matter, are going to say, well, of course Black Lives Matter. Others are going to respond, and we've all heard this one, all lives matter. And then still others, we heard a lot during the protests of last spring and last summer, blue lives matter as an expression of solidarity with police. I like to think about it like a bit like John Legend and the rapper Common did with the song that they wrote for the movie Selma. And in that song, which won an Academy Award, they said, justice for all just ain't specific enough. And what they were trying to say is, you know, it was this Black Lives Matter as a call to action, and just saying all lives matter isn't specific enough to convey the message that Black Lives Matter activists want to convey. Let's pursue that point. So why is it that Black Lives Matter has been a controversial topic if you're saying all lives matter? Most of us first heard Black Lives Matter in the context of the demonstrations which happened in Ferguson and around the country when Michael Brown was killed in 2014 by a Ferguson police officer. If you're not aware of the Justice Department study, you should know that there had long been a contentious relationship between the black community in Ferguson and the police. What a lot of people don't know is Ferguson, Missouri isn't by any stretch of the imagination the ghetto. In fact, what it is was a working class suburb. But that working class suburb essentially was doing things like maintaining the budgets for their police and fire departments by ticketing for little trivial things people who lived there, disproportionately African Americans. And so it was a money-making scheme. And so this tough relationship between them. And that was the context in which Michael Brown had this contested relationship with the cop that led to Brown's death. And the resulting was Black Lives Matter protesters saying, you know, Michael Brown's life should matter, Black Lives Matter. I have to emphasize that no one who was a part of that movement has made it an exclusionary concept. It is not to say only Black Lives Matter, but rather they were asserting Black lives do matter. And it's because Black lives do matter, but they have not, but these are people who felt like they have not mattered in the United States. That they had to assert and put forward that Black Lives Matter. It's almost like you could put two on the end of it. Black Lives Matter too, because too often we haven't mattered. So I'm going to give you two examples that I think may make the case for it at least should be a contested landscape of thinking about things to talk about Black Lives Matter. One is by a group of criminologists, and here I'll be very academic and show you some data to make the case that I think that Black lives haven't always mattered. And then I'm going to give you a little more of a personal example, which I hope works. So Bowers and Pierce did this research around 1980. And what they did is they looked at sentences to death. But this was after the Supreme Court had outlawed the death penalty in the United States, and they had outlawed it because it was applied inequitably along racial lines. And so immediately after the declaration of unconstitutional, states then went into a position of trying to figure out a form of exercising the death penalty that would pass Supreme Court muster. And Virginia was one of a number of states that rapidly reinstituted the death penalty in a way that would not be racially biased. So what Bowers and Pierce wanted to do was they wanted to think in terms of to what extent was working, but they also wanted to think in terms of two dynamics, not just what the race of the offender was, but what about the race of the victim? Did it play a point? And it makes a powerful point along the conversations about do Black Lives Matter. So what they did is they looked at the victim-offender racial combination, number of offenders, what proportion were sentenced, the number sentenced to death, and then the probability of a death sentence. And I think they're illustrative. So when a black person kills a white person during those years in Virginia, 53 of the 240 were sentenced to death, just over 20%. When a white kills a white, considerably, two things I want you to notice here is the much larger number of deaths that were whites killing whites, but less than 5% were sentenced to death. When a black kills a black, notice an even higher number, but look at the infinitesimal number of people who were sentenced to death. This kind of sends a message. These black victims may not have mattered as much as those white victims. Certainly didn't matter as much as those white victims who were killed by black perpetrators. But what happens when a white kills a black? 0%. Sends a message. Do the Black Lives Matter? Question. Bowers and Pierce in 1980 didn't ask that question. I think if they were interviewed today, they'd say it's self-evident that some lives matter more than other lives. Okay? And if you're thinking, well, that's Virginia, they found comparable results in Georgia, Texas, and Ohio as well. Essentially the same patterns. It may not have been perfect, the same numbers, but the same patterns emerged. The more personal example, asking the question about Black Lives Matter. Look at the faces here. Now, the personal example, well, look at my skin coloring. I've come to understand that many whites don't see the distinctions that we see among ourselves in skin coloring, but trust me, I look different from these folks. My skin coloring is lighter than those folks. Now, my African ancestors probably came from Western or Central Africa. They look like these people in Sierra Leone, or the people like Ivory Coast, considerably darker than I am. We all can agree? So at some point in my family's history, my ancestors were dragged from their homes, put on slave ships, and transported to America. When they came over, they looked like this. They had that kind of skin coloring. Now, imagine being in the holds of those ships for 80 days during the Middle Passage. 12.5 million Africans were brought across the Atlantic to the Americas in the slave trade. In the Middle Passage, estimates were 2 to 4 million died during that 80-day trip. 2 to 4 million. Did Black Lives matter then? They were simply part of a cargo that didn't make it. But that's really not the point I want to make here. I want to make the point that essentially my ancestors were probably taken from a ship like this in Virginia, because that's where both my mother and father hailed from, and those ancestors looked like my brothers and sisters in Western Africa. Somewhere along the line, this happened. What do I mean, this happened? Well, Ancestry.com tells me that about 51% of my DNA comes from Africa. The other 49% or so come from primarily Europe. How did this happen? It happened because slave women were taken without consent, because they couldn't give consent, by white masters, overseers, and members of the community. It happened because whites who were in superordinate positions in the South, in Virginia, could take black women, and black women, even after emancipation, could not complain. Because if they complained, it's one, no one would listen. Two, if they did listen, it might lead to them or their families being lynched simply by raising the question, because they couldn't give consent because of their subordinate position. What do we call that? We call that rape, right? So we end up looking like this because of the victimization of black women during slavery and post-slavery periods. That's a personal example. So let's look now at data with that as a backdrop. So Parrington in '63 did a study of Virginia, because Virginia, longer than most other states, continued to define rape as a capital offense, and wanted to look at who was actually executed for incidences of rape in the state of Virginia. Again, my parents' home state, so it's a direct sort of comparison. And what did he find? Total blacks convicted of rape offenses, 1,560 during that period. Total whites, 1,238. 41 of those people, of that total, were executed for rape. 13 were executed for attempted rape. One was executed for rape and robbery. One was executed for attempted rape and highway robbery. Total of 56 people were executed for rape at Virginia. Remember, how did I get this way, right? All that were executed were black. Virginia did not execute a white person for rape. What's that tell us? Did the lives of those black women matter? Now you want to know why there are those people in Ferguson and in Pittsburgh and in Cleveland and where I live now, Seattle, chanting Black Lives Matter, asserting it. It's because many black people feel like in America, black lives haven't mattered. Thus the question mark that I've asked. So, why is it such contested territory? Because in my view, it's been inaccurately politicized for various reasons. As I said before, the declaration that Black Lives Matter is not exclusionary. There's no one saying white lives don't matter. There's no one saying anybody's lives don't matter. But it's instead saying black lives matter too. Black lives should matter. People talk about BLM as if it's an organization, a formal organization. It's not, it's a social movement. You know, why do people call it an organization? Well, one of the reasons I suspect people want to call it an organization is because it's easy to involve it in conspiracy theories. You've probably heard of it on the news. BLM is planning to invade Washington, D.C. to do this. BLM is planning to disrupt that. There is no national BLM, it's a social movement. Now, there may be local organizations, which some are more formal than others, some are more organized than others, but this notion of BLM, it fits into various conspiracy theories. It's easy to talk about, rather than talking about what the real essence of it is, which is to say, black lives should matter too. It's a movement asserting that Black Lives Matter among people who felt like they have not mattered. But what I'd like this to do is to think a little bit less about what people say, but what people do. And here today, I want to focus on what the justice system says and does when we talk about Black Lives Matter. Thank you, Anthony. But before, let's do some basics about race and crime that sort of give us a groundwork for thinking about how we should think about this. One, we have to start with an honest fact. Crime in America is intra-racial, within racial groups. Not exclusively, but predominantly. That is, blacks victimize blacks, whites victimize whites, Latinos victimize Latinos. That's the pattern. And it's not for some heavy psychological or sociological reason. It's because we are today still a residentially, racially segregated society. America is only slightly more integrated in terms of where we live today than we were in 1950 before the modern civil rights movement. We are still very segregated as a society. And most crime tends to happen close to home. People victimize the people close to where they live. So as long as we're a racially segregated society, it's going to be these intra-racial, it's going to be an intra-racial phenomenon. So let's look at the realities of race and crime. The cold, painful fact is that African Americans commit and are victimized by homicide more than other groups in the United States. The black homicide rate is higher than the white homicide rate. And the most frequent victims of that homicide are other black people. If you look at other violent crimes, like rape and aggravated assault, but especially rape, it's still elevated, but it's not as high as homicide. If you look at property crimes, it's a little bit ambiguous. There are some studies that find racial differences in property crimes, and others don't find any real significant racial differences in property crimes. And then when it comes to drugs, it's really fascinating. There are no racial differences in drug offenses, either as people who sell or use or possess. We know that about 13% of America's population is African American. The best evidence is about 13% of drug users and drug sellers are African American. Right now, I think the Latino population is roughly 18%. 18% drug users, drug sellers. Essentially, we use and sell drugs in about the same proportion we're a part of the population. That's a point I'll come back to it a little bit. But fundamentally, there are no observable racial differences in drugs. So some basic facts about race and justice. Let's start with police and police contacts. So Jeffrey Fagan, who's at Columbia Law School, and his colleagues have been doing some work looking at the stop and frisk. In fact, Fagan used to do a lot of work with the NYPD. They won't let him in the building anymore because they're unhappy with his results. The big finding from some of their research, and they have a number of articles, and I should have said before, you'll notice the footnotes here, particularly for the students. I want you to know there. I'm going to leave my slides with Professor Hanneman, and so at the back end of the slides are references that are there. So if a student wants to follow up on any of the things I'm talking about, you can go to him and he'll be able to give you the references to follow up and use the work that I'm talking about. So Fagan and his colleagues, studied the stop and frisk policy. And for those who may not know, stop and frisk was really a police policy using what's referred to as Terry stops, because it's a Supreme Court decision that found that police officers would justify it and could make Terry stops, meaning a stop of a person who they suspected might be involved in a crime. And so did they have to have probable cause? No. They could just simply think they're acting peculiar, or they're in a place peculiar, it looks suspicious, something might be going on, and they could stop, interview them. In fact, most people call this stop, interview, and frisk. And they could do this, and what would happen? Well, what Fagan and his colleagues found out was that in New York City, where stop and frisk was prominently held as this magical crime reduction policy, they found that it really didn't reduce crime very much. And it was very focused on Black and Latino young people, usually young men, but not just young men, who were disproportionately stopped and frisked. And they found that people who were frequently stopped by the police and frisked would develop a psychological reaction where they would act nervous, and they would be acting bizarre and just sort of nervous when they saw a police officer, when they saw a police car. Interestingly, one of the things the police use to decide whether somebody looks suspicious is, are they acting nervous and jumpy? Well, they look like they're up to no good, and they stop them again. Another thing that Fagan et al. Found was that when people were handled roughly during these stop and frisk moments, they were likely to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. What do we know about PTSD? It leads to behavior which can be criminal. So what Fagan and colleagues found is that stop and frisk probably didn't reduce crime in New York, it probably caused crime in New York. So race and justice, a policy that got pushed out all over the country, which probably caused more crime without reducing crime. And it was correlated with race. Well, a second group of studies that I've done with some colleagues at the University of Washington actually looks at contacts with police. And I'll hopefully make it clear why we're just talking about contacts in a moment. And what we did is we took a sample of 300 kids in Seattle schools that were collected when they were in the 8th grade. They're now about 30. And this study didn't collect these data for this purpose, but rather we looked at them, and it was the same research institute that had the data, and we said, we can repurpose these things. Great secondary use of data, in my view, but I'm a little bit biased, to sort of say, can we ask an important question? And we were what we were interested in is, did those 8th grade kids, was there a race difference in whether they had a negative police contact? And we found out that there was a significant race difference. Well, the immediate question you should have, after I've told you that there are racial differences in criminality, there aren't that many racial differences in minor delinquency, I would point out, but after I've told you that would be, well, maybe the black kids are having more negative police contacts because they're more likely to be in trouble. So we statistically controlled for that. We took into account any racial differences in criminality, and we found that still those black kids were more likely to have those negative police contacts compared to their white classmates. What did explain it? If they'd been in trouble in school, or if the police were familiar with their family, sort of like the, oh, he's one of the Jacksons, must be in trouble kind of approach to things. Or it's in school with teachers involving school resource officers in school discipline, thus a negative contact. Most jurisdictions say police shouldn't do that. It's striking how often they do. The teachers and school officials will use the resource officer to enforce school discipline rather than the schools doing it, and these kids have these negative contacts. Well, we then looked at those same kids in the 10th grade and said, what effect did it have on their arrests? And what we found is, what predicted a kid's likelihood of arrest in the 10th grade? If they had had a negative contact in the 8th grade. Again, independently of criminal involvement, independent of any delinquency involvement. Simply having had that police contact in the 8th grade increased the likelihood, independently, that they would be arrested in the 10th grade. And then we looked at them again at 20 and said, to what extent is this accounting for more criminal behavior at 20? Well, we didn't really find that it had this big, powerful effect on crime. We found something more disturbing. We look at the white kids and the black kids. Among white kids, white 20-year-olds, they're no longer kids. Among white 20-year-olds, having been arrested in 10th grade had no effect on them at 20. The white kids who were contacted by police had the same level of criminality, the same amount of arrests as the white kids who were not contacted or arrested in the 10th grade. No effect. It didn't have any lasting effect on these kids' behavior. But among blacks at 20, those who had been arrested in the 10th grade were 11 times more likely to be arrested at 20, independent of criminal behavior. 11 times more likely. So those early contacts were having these profoundly powerful effects on young black people, but not young white people. Those police interactions really mattered. What about sentencing? Now, sentencing reforms, it's in quotes because what we play with is, well, we tried sentencing reform, and we did all kind of things in the 70s and 80s. We did things like something called truth in sentencing. So you do a crime, you get a sentence, and you do that amount of time. We took a lot of sentencing decisions out of the hands of judges. We're going to make it more bureaucratic and put it in the hands of sentencing commissions and all these kinds of things. Now, it's really interesting that it's had disproportionate effect on blacks. It's led to more black incarceration, more black imprisonment. And if you really look at it, both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, participated. Neither side wanted to be painted as easy on crime, light on crime, soft on crime. And so they out-toughed on crime on each other. And it led to this increasingly long sentences. It's led to what we call mass incarceration. For those of you who may not be criminal justice majors, you should know that between 1980 and 2010, the United States locked up 5 times more people in prisons in 2010 compared to 1980. We quintupled the number of our citizens we were locked up. We like to say we're number one. We can proudly say we're number, because we lock up a larger portion of our population than every other country in the world. We were high before, but now with mass incarceration, boom, and it's disproportionately affected blacks. Also, both liberals and conservatives were proponents of these reforms for different reasons. One group wanted to get tough on crime, other group wanted to have more predictability and less bias. Both sides participated, and it had this devastating effect. So race, crime, and imprisonment. Just want to briefly mention Bloomstein and Beck, two criminologists who did some really interesting work that was sort of published in the National Academies of Sciences mass incarceration study. And what they found, they looked at the difference between what they refer to and what we refer to as warranted and unwarranted racial differences in imprisonment. Warranted meaning that portion of racial differences in imprisonment that can justifiably be accounted for by racial differences in criminality. Versus unwarranted, meaning that portion of racial differences that cannot be accounted by any difference in crime. And what they found is they looked per type of offense. For homicide, racial differences in homicide account for about 95% of the racial differences in imprisonment. So, it's pretty, the warranted part was pretty much there. But if you look at less serious violent crimes, it drops to around, depending on which crime you look at, about 70 to 80% can be justified and warranted. But if you look at drug crimes, almost none of the racial differences in imprisonment for drug crimes can be accounted for racial differences in actual behavior. It's just not there. War on drugs accounts for about a third of the increase of what we've talked about in mass incarceration. Devastating effect on black and brown defendants and black and brown communities that cannot be explained, cannot be justified by crime differences. So if you want to talk about, we don't want to talk about race in imprisonment. If you do the crime, you do the time. You can probably justifiably say that about homicide. You cannot say that about drug offenses. You cannot say that about a number of offenses. And what Beck and Bloomstein do is that they do it very emphatically, and nobody's going to look at their work and say, it's not science. Yeah, it's the best science out there. Okay. So why do we see these patterns? If we're going to talk about, the 40 years I taught at the University of Washington, I would say there are racial differences in crime. And I would look out into the big classes I taught, and you could see the pained look on black students, and they're like, even he says it. But the question isn't why those differences, are those differences there? The question should be, why are those differences there? What a number of people, Sampson and his colleagues, I would say most emphatically show, is that it's about living in places which are deeply socially and economically disadvantaged. If you can statistically take into account social disadvantage, economic disadvantage, the racial differences in neighborhood level violence, including homicide, virtually disappear. It's because of where people live and the level of disadvantage. My own work focuses on labor market inequality. And when you take into account labor market inequality, which are profound and long-lasting, it really makes a difference. And here I'm going to engage in a shameless plug. My book, which makes these arguments, is not that people engage in crime if they're unemployed or out of work or jobless because they need to make money, but our work conditions our lifestyle. Our work conditions how we engage in the world and engage in life. And if somebody's jobless, marginal to the job market, they don't have good jobs and those kind of things, if you're 35 years old and the best job you can get is at Mickey D's, it's going to lead to certain lifestyle patterns which makes crime more likely. Okay, that's that argument. So the why we see racial differences is a disadvantage, it's economic disadvantage, it's social disadvantage. And then Ruth Peterson, that Professor Traverso just mentioned earlier in the introduction, she and her colleague Lauren Creva did this wonderful book called Divergent Worlds, where they looked at 87 cities across the United States, and they looked at patterns of racial residential segregation overlapping with disadvantage and employment, and they found two really important things. One is that segregation really has a negative effect. And what racial segregation, residential segregation does is it concentrates the negative effects of poverty and disadvantage. It just concentrates and focuses there. They had a problem, though, because they looked at all these cities across the country, and they wanted to be able to compare racially disadvantaged black neighborhoods with racially disadvantaged white neighborhoods, and they couldn't find comparable white neighborhoods. Very few white kids in cities grow up in the kind of negative circumstances that a large portion of African Americans do. You just can't study it because white kids aren't growing up like those black kids are growing up. So they found that racial residential segregation probably makes a difference, but the perfect study would have a way of doing that, but we don't live in a way that even allows that to happen because divergent worlds, black people and white people in America live differently, and it has criminological and criminal justice consequences. And then there's the work of Elijah Anderson, and found that he did ethnographic work. All of our work is quantitative. His work is ethnographic, and what he did with his ethnographies in Philadelphia came to the conclusion that what happens in those negative places where it's generation after generation devastated, disadvantaged, on the margins of society, in those same places when they call the police don't come. I can give you examples if you want in the Q&A, at least one example. The police don't come, they're not there. So what they do is they sort of do enforcement themselves. They find a way to do it. And that's what you get this sort of like, I had to shoot him, he disrespected me. And the notion is if you don't take care of it yourself, you're going to be victimized. And so that happens. And so this sort of belief system, this cultural system emerges as a consequence of the structural inequality that people are forced to live in, which creates more crime. And so why are there racial differences in criminality? It's because where people live. It's the conditions under which they live. So, do Black Lives Matter? This really isn't a research question. This is really a question about look at the evidence and come to your conclusion. And if you think, well, I would ask you to look at the evidence and come to your own conclusions. For my conclusions, historically, no, in my view, black lives have not mattered. Today, I do believe things have improved for black people in America, but we have a way to go yet. So let's look at some evidence. Lynching. As gruesome as these pictures are, we have to look at it. We should confront it. It's a powerful form of how white supremacy was enforced in this country, not just in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. My friend and colleague Stuart Tolney and his colleagues have documented people who were victims of lynching in their work. And what they found was that it's a profound effect, and it's happening even today. They didn't study James Byrd, but it's a good example. James Byrd was the African-American man who was chained to a pickup truck by a group of white supremacists and dragged for miles and killed, ripped his body apart. Not lynched with a rope, but a lynching nevertheless. From their work, you can see the pattern of lynchings in the 10 states that they followed. The numbers did decline into the 1920s, but you'll notice there's still some of those years where more than 20 people were lynched. And why were they lynched? They did this kind of documentation where they put names to people and some substance to people. They went back in historical records and traced it. And again, the references are in the slides at the back end if you want to follow up on that. And they found that the victims of lynching were sometimes white, but mostly black. They were old, they were young, they were men, they were women, they were children. There were instances where somebody was charged with a homicide, may have never gotten to court and were lynched. Others were lynched because they were uppity, not acting the way black people should. Still others, he was lynched because he looked the wrong way at a white woman. Sometimes whole families ended up dying because of offenses like being uppity, is what they found. Do Black Lives Matter? Historically, ask yourself the question. If you're interested, there's a new museum that's opened up in Montgomery, Alabama, the Lynching Museum. Each one of these pillars represents a lynch victim. It goes on, and from the perspective of the picture, it comes back the other way, just to see how many people in this country were killed without anything that would look at all like anything we legitimately call due process. So what about today? Well, let's look at the thing that brought us to this point where we're talking about the killing of George Floyd, the killing of African Americans. Well, the federal government doesn't count police shootings. They probably will start soon, but the best evidence we have on police shootings has actually been put together by the Washington Post. They did a police shootings database, and you can, the footnote 18 actually can take you to a website where it's there. And what they found was the rate of shootings by police of African Americans, the rate is twice as high as the rate of shootings of whites, even though, again, blacks are only 13% of the population. And it's mostly young men. Stop and frisk policies, which I already told you had a negative consequence, are still advocated by some people. Some politicians will say we need to go back to stop and frisk to solve our crime problems, in spite of the racial disproportionality. Mass incarceration is the abject failures of crime control policy. The National Academies of Sciences found that mass incarceration, back up a second, while mass incarceration was building up, there was something we refer to in criminology as the great crime decline. What proportion of the crime decline was a result of mass incarceration? Economists using econometric tools found that about 1% or less of the crime decline can be attributed to mass incarceration. Terribly expensive policy. It costs about, nationally across the country, it costs about $35,000 a year to keep an adult male in prison. Think what you could do with that $35,000 a year in higher education. But we lock people up with that. It's not because we treat them nice either. It's because it costs that much to lock people up for a long period of time. And it has not reduced crime, but it has devastating effect on black and brown communities. The war on drugs, analysts now say, was essentially a war on black and brown people. We engage in these practices, we support these practices, they do little to protect the public, they're very expensive, and we persist in them. Do Black Lives Matter in that context? So, can we really do something better? There are a number of policies that people have advocated. Radical change that some people say we have to have now, like defund the police or abolition of police. There are those who would say, they don't really mean that, but I actually know criminologists. I know of politicians, I know of people in leadership positions that say essentially we should defund the police. In my town of Seattle, our city council is probably, as we speak, developing defund the police at least by 50% policies. And there are people who believe in complete abolition of police departments. I'm a data guy. I can't get on board with that because I'm going to say, show me the evidence that that's what's going to work for communities. Show me the evidence that's what's going to work for neighborhoods. Or we can talk about reform. And some people say, well, we've tried that. But I would ask the question, have we engaged in real reform? What do I mean by that? Real police accountability. The state of Colorado has gone farther than any other state right now in changing their laws to make police more accountable. And the early returns, the early reaction is that it seems to be having some positive effect. In terms of, one, police are being charged, and they think that that's going to change police behavior. So it might be possible. Stay tuned. Let's keep an eye on Colorado. How about police responsiveness to communities? We've long believed that in the black community, black communities were overly policed and underprotected. By that I mean overly policed for Mickey Mouse little things like jaywalking, like loitering, like black kids sort of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with a Raiders jacket on. I don't get wearing Raiders clothes, but I'm a Steelers fan, so But that's over-policing, but under-protecting. Black people, we now know, are more likely to report victimization to the police than others in our community. So it's not that black people don't go to the police. Black people are more likely to report victimization to police, but black crime is less likely to be found, to be declared by police. So it's not because black people won't cooperate as victims, but they don't get the protection that they need given what's happening in their communities. Reform bill, charging bills. Right now, many of our policies are really geared towards essentially creating new forms of debtors' prisons because of the way we fine people, the way that we react to them financially. If you're poor and you get a fine of $1,000, it really matters. and it can drag you back to court and back to court and back to court. But if you're a middle class or certainly an upper class person, $1,000, no problem. You write it and you go away. But there's a real sort of pattern there. Then there are communities solutions that people recommended. And some of them might really work, and we need more evaluation of them. The one I would mention is Operation Ceasefire in Boston. Some people call it the Boston Miracle. And it was really sort of a compelling program. They did things like they did gun buybacks. It was a group of black ministers working with police, working with nonprofits, working with the community, and they did gun buybacks, they did gang intervention stuff. They did things like, let's help families do better and help find jobs for the parents in those families. And they sort of did this holistic approach, and early returns are that it made a difference, that it brought down violence in Boston and stays down. And there's a website there you can check out. But community solutions can also have negative consequences. There's something called the defended communities approach or concerns. And defended communities means what's the bad side of what happens when communities take over? And a classic example is this in Howard Beach neighborhood of New York, where 3 African-American young men decided to go to a dance in Howard Beach. And a group of young white men saw them and thought, oh, they're here looking for white women. And they chased them onto a freeway where one of them was killed. That's community in action, defending their community. Those brothers, one of them died, another was seriously injured as a result of that action. Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, 2 African Americans who were killed, were both killed by people engaging in community level enforcement. We need to remember that there's a negative side of that, and we need to be aware if we're going to go that direction. So, with all this, what conclusions would I draw? Well, one, I want to emphasize that no community needs good policing more than black communities. I say this because of those homicide differences that I talked about. I say this about those because of the crime differences we talked about. But I want to emphasize good policing, not just simply an occupying army, but a responsive to the community, accountable policing in those communities. The black community needs that. And so when people talk about abolition of police, what's going to happen to those communities which were victimized? They need good policing, not an occupying army, would be my argument, my conclusion from the results I've seen. Do Black Lives matter? You have to judge the evidence for yourself. For me, I have to say Black lives should matter, but they don't yet. Are BLM activists un-American? I'd submit to you that what they're engaged in is among the most American things that anybody could be engaged in. Think about it. Think about the preamble to the Constitution. How does it start? In order to form a more perfect union. The founders of this country didn't believe they were founding a perfect country, but a country that was being processed, that would get better, to form, they would work to create that more perfect union. And that's exactly what the early civil rights activists were doing. Now remember, when Martin Luther King and others were out there protesting, people would say, you want to go too fast. We don't like what you're doing. You're making us uncomfortable. You want to change too much. But now we deify them. Now, I'm all for that. But remember how we think about them today, but think back to how they were defined then. And it wasn't in positive terms. Okay? But what they were doing was they were working to form that more perfect union. And that is no different than Black Lives activists of today. They're making people uncomfortable. Some of us may not like how they're doing it, but what they're doing is they're working to form a more perfect union. They're doing exactly the same thing that the founders of this country did. Look at the last words of the Declaration of Independence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. Will we form that more perfect union? A union of justice for all, where Black lives do matter? It's up to all of us. Are we willing to, like the nation's founders, like the early civil rights movement people, like the current Black Lives Matter activists, are we willing to pledge our lives, our fortune, our sacred honor towards making this a better union? where all lives matter? That's a question mark. Thank you.